Hi, Mark. Love your enthusiasm. You're always like there on time. Hi, everyone. Just gonna wait for everybody to join in. Thanks, Mark. Good evening, Chetan. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being so regular with all the talks. Hi, Nida. Hi, Rishi. I'm just saying hi to familiar names and hello to everyone else as well. Hi, Siva. We're just giving about 5 minutes to let everybody join. Thank you, Chetan. I think, shall we?
Yeah,
And I
please.
will join as and when they will. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining once again to many of you this evening for the third of the four-part series titled Reflections on Representation, which is a conversation series hosted by the CPB Learning Lab and the Polis project, supported by Photo South Asia. Thank you, Suchitra. Welcome once again. For making this happen. We've really been uh, immersed in some very important conversations as everybody's facing the second wave of COVID, and pretty much most of us are still under restrictions. So thank you so much. At least it's important to talk about a lot of these topics and issues, and just for everybody to know. This series is emerging out of Suchitra Vijayan's recent book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, returning to the fundamental questions of representation. And today we have with us Laura Saunders. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be discussing her work on the US Mexico borderlands. And I will hand over to Suchitra and Laura to share their knowledge with all of us today. Thank you so much, both of you.
Um, Suchi, thank you so much for the introduction. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that this has been an incredibly difficult week for many communities globally. For someone like me who straddles not one but many homes, it feels like deja vu, because exactly a year ago, New York went through exactly what's going now. We've heard stories of death, devastation, people, struggling to get oxygen cylinders. So I'm truly grateful, and I understand that a lot of our audience actually are based out of South Asia. So I'm both truly moved and grateful for your time, because we understand that time is also political. At the same time, in my other home, this week was an important moment because the George Floyd judgment came. And just as much as that is important, we kind of wanted to start with that. Um, and Laura is a photographer whose work I've followed for quite a few years now. And Laura is someone who's spoken about these issues. So while we will be discussing Laura's two very important projects, I really wanted to start with acknowledging what happened with the George Floyd's case, but also understanding the visual aspect of the case, because it took a video of violence against a black body to be recorded and circulated and recirculated so many times, even for a sense of justice to come. So Laura, I wanted to start with your thoughts on what this video, you've spoken about this especially in relationship to the virality of videos, especially violence against black and brown bodies. Talk to us about this, and then we can kind of move forward with discussing your important work.
I want to say hi and thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here in this company. Suchitra, I've also really appreciated your work, and I'm so excited that we're getting a chance to talk about the many parallels that exist on these topics. It feels really important and really relevant. I'm coming to you from a small little corner of Virginia. It's unceded Tutelo land, so I want to acknowledge that as well, that I'm on Indigenous land. And I just want to thank everyone, repeat the gratitude that I have for everyone taking the time in their day to be here. Life is overwhelming right now. And so I hope this can be a time that feels fortifying, and like there's a bit of community here to talk about things as we see them and feel them. So with all that said, I think this week has really been an interesting sort of culmination of a moment in time that's really illustrating what photography, I think, has become on the edge of all this technology. I think we're at the edge of understanding what virality does. I've seen some really wonderful commentary happening from Black writers and from Black thinkers and individuals who talk about the repetition of violence that we saw with lynchings in those eras where that was happening, and how this is a replication of that same violence, of how white gaze and white consumption of death, of Black death in particular, and of inaction, or maybe even sort of a fascination with it. It's not deeply acknowledged in many circles. I think particularly news media has to really grapple with their relationship to arriving in a place that's not their community and expecting to extract really real experiences from people who are going through trauma and who are going through things that they can't just close their laptop and be done with. So I personally, in my own work, really try to consider what it means to make an image of suffering, and what it means to share that image and where it gets shared. We need to be having conversations, which we're having. I think I wonder a lot about this thing of like, you have to see it to feel something. I've heard a lot of really great critique about if you feel something and then do nothing, where do we land there? So I have questions about the morality of assuming that it's ours to stay with and to even have possession of. These images become just public for people to have to see whether or not they want to see it. And I just hope from here on out we can take some care in what that means for people, and recognize that we can only be as healthy as the choices we're making around the work that we do, and even what we share and endorse. Oh, you're on mute.
I kind of quickly want to go and discuss the Mexican American Borderlands work. Um, it's an important work. It's a work that it's beautiful, it's tender, it's humane. But I would also want our audience today to kind of hear this from you. Talk to us about the Borderlands work, how it started, and then we can kind of tease out some of the threads and then the parallels.
Yeah, so my work has been primarily focused in Southern Arizona. I have spent time in Southern Texas as well, looking at specifically detention facilities and the implementation of border industry. So what that would look like is different surveillance tactics or more incarceration carceral facilities, and their relationship to the small communities that exist there. This actually began when I was doing my master's program in London and I was looking at detention in the UK, which runs really differently. But when I lost my visa and was kicked out, I came back and was curious, what was the uh, North American experience of this, the U.S. experience of this, and how did it look different? And what the main thing that I saw was the money. It was a massively profitable industry, and I was blown away at first. So really, the old journalism tactic, follow the money, is what I did. And I did that by, researching policy, researching where funds were being pumped, researching who was making money. I was watching archival videos of private prison businesses as they gleefully announced their first ever immigrant detention facility. So just really trying to get into these moments of like maybe seemingly benign interest, and peeling back what that meant and who was there and why. And out of that, I started traveling there. I have family there. I now have community there. I'm in a cooperative there, the Juntos Photo Cooperative. And, my relationships there and the individuals who were giving of their times and experiences really helped me to just sort of step away from the privilege of intellectualizing this into the feeling of it. And it grew from there. I could go into more, but I feel like that's like a pretty wide synopsis for you for now.
One of the things that really drew me to your work when I first encountered it, was because I was still in the process of figuring out what to do with all of the research that I had. And I was thinking through, and I was really interested in how other photographers and writers were assembling the work together. I kind of want to go back to the moment when you talk about, you followed the money, right? Which is a very different way and approach of looking at the border, because a lot of the border work you see is always about the border being represented as this no man land, as a space that is, so surreal that, so you actually never locate, you see these stunning images without any politics to it. So tell us, how did you assemble this? Because this project documents the present, but there's also a deep colonial history that one can reach out and learn from. Can you talk to us about the assembling of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. The archives were part of my original sort of stepping in. I was able to travel to Washington, D.C. and use the National Archives. And so I was looking at um, things from that I had found from the land, from looking back in time, and looking at things like the Gadsden Purchase, which cut off water access to indigenous tribes. So what was the consequence of that? It was their loss of autonomy and of control. And so that meant then that um, the settler society became dominant and needed a way to uphold itself. And you see things like internment camps, in the 40s when we were at war, becoming a site of further violence and othering, again, to make sure that the settler project was successful or worked. And so I looked at internment archives, and I looked at how the theft of this land became a legacy and helped facilitate other things like this, at the absolute disgust of the indigenous tribes that were there. The Gila River internment camp is one of the places I focused. And they hadn't ever given permission, just like they hadn't given permission for the treaties to be broken. So you just see this through line of the violence and how it shows up. And I felt like these archives really were, I mean, first of all, aesthetically, they're incredible. There's such a moment, and there's such a they're unto themselves. Like, they exist in this world of what was happening to these people, and these moments of tenderness and of life, you know, weddings and like games being played, and heritage that they were holding on to in the face of everything. And so I felt like that was also something that was really important to make sure didn't get erased from the storytelling. You know, people would be like, what does this have to do with the border? And it's like everything, right? Because this is still what we're doing. We're still trying to flatten people into criminals. We're still trying to say, you only get to exist in this way, which is at the behest of what we need you to be. And so the archives were essential. It became like a poem that got to weave in and speak for itself, I think, in a lot of ways, or at least I wanted it to.
No, I think it's wonderful, and I'm so glad that you brought the aspect of violence, because often, as you said, everything is collapsing people into criminals. Everything's about an act of crossing, but never the act of theft. I kind of want to place this project in the present. Um, the United States just went through what many called an historic election. The Biden won. The Biden campaign focused on the children's cages and how, you know, immigrant facilities and ICE was acting. And yet, a few months in today, we see that the policies that the Biden administration is putting in place are not particularly that different. Of course, there's slight differences, but the net effect is still same. Now we see kids being separated on the border. Could you speak to us about this idea of not only how we think about the present, but how these acts of migration continue to be vilified, how even as a presidential administration changes, the underlying rules of the empire continues to play out in these spaces? I know it's a very loaded question, so I'll kind of let you tackle it
I'll try to take pieces of where they come in for me. Yeah, I mean, that the project that we were just discussing touches on this historical use of detention as a means of control. There's a photo that I used in there from the archives of one of the earliest detention facilities on Ellis Island. So the excuse of keeping people in a prison-like state, or in a prison, in fact, in a prison, has been used from the beginning, essentially, of the American initiative. So that's not new, but the shape of it continues to shift, and the rhetoric continues to shift. You know, I think tactically what you see globally, even not just in the US, is that people talk about children in a way that has compassion, but not for their families, or for the damage that's done, you know, when an adult is incarcerated in this regard, trying to seek asylum. And we're seeing now currently this use of separating families looking different, in that they're being quote unquote reunited, but then left in limbo. You know, other policies that came in during the Obama administration, there was a plan called Frontera Sur, and it still exists. It just pumped a ton of money into Mexico and to Central America to fortify basically US defenses that extended the border and made crossing actually more dangerous for people. So yeah, these implementations look different in different moments, but they're constantly doing the same thing. Regardless of what political leaning you might see, the infrastructure is so compelling and so profitable that to change it would be drastic, and would really, you know, it would have to reroute the entire sort of thinking around what immigration would look like, or could look like, in this contemporary society.
Before we go and discuss the Mountain Valley Pipeline project that you've been documenting, I want to bridge the gap between these two by speaking about another issue that you have spoken about consistently. One of it is about the responsibility and sometimes also the culpability of photojournalists, reporters, and writers when it comes to issues of representation. Also, this often the crisis of systemic mistakes that one sees within industries. I know our first conversation was also about this many years ago. I was wondering if you could address that. And I know that we've had this conversation a few years ago, and I kind of want to revisit that conversation now. And then I also want to hear from you in terms of what you think has perhaps changed, maybe not, or also where your thoughts are on this issue.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad to talk about it. I think there are wonderful conversations happening and really important shifts being made, but not without really actually pretty violent blowback, to be totally honest. I think that there is a better collective voice happening about the inherent bias of, a Western white privileged journalist, and the different identities that might fall into that, who have been given these opportunities to tell stories globally, since the sort of beginning of what we saw as news media. And I think rightfully they're being challenged. I think rightfully people are asking really good questions about, the colonial origins of the camera as a tool itself, of documentation, of categorization, and of classing people in a way that actually dehumanizes them. And I think we see that continue to happen in the way, we talked about the reality of Black death and of people elsewhere as well, and how people who are white are just treated with much more regard visually. So that's a conversation I see happening. And I also see really important discussions happening about power dynamics. And, that plays into all this, but I mean that in the sense of coercive, perhaps, strategies to get access to a place, rather than looking at it as a relationship, right? Or building a community, or having an accountability process outside of your newsroom. Yeah, I think we have a long way to go. And I also think that there's people doing really fantastic work in bringing this to the forefront that I'm super grateful to be in company with.
Yeah. But Laura, one more follow up, and then we will go into to discuss the Mont Valley pipeline project. You're right. People are asking questions. And I know a lot of labor goes into asking these questions. And I know that sometimes the act of openly challenging and asking questions, especially towards the powerful, could also have other ramifications in terms of access to work, fellowships. Is asking the questions you think now actually resulting in change? Because every time something happens, I see so many of you collectively going out. Speaking out is an act of labor, and yet the same things repeat, sometimes even a few weeks apart. Where do you see this act of questioning playing out in terms of actual accountability? How far away are we from real accountability?
I think systems of power will always protect themselves. And I think it's naive to not understand the way the business of photography is going to protect itself in that regard. By questioning motives around consent, they're questioning, is it profitable for us to put this on a wall? Is it profitable for us to publish this? That's a massive undertaking. I think the thing I felt the biggest shift in is there's more of a community for people who are paying attention to this and finding alternatives, and not making a seat at the table, but like this phrase of building a new table, which is really transformative, if nothing else, in being affirming and of letting you work in a way that you might be vilified for in other spaces, or blackballed for in other spaces, but you have people who care about you, who trust the work you're doing, who will be honest with you if you misstep, who will hold you accountable. I think there's more of those spaces now than there ever have been. The Me Too moment was really hard in the photo industry. There's pervasive misuse of power that has been really normalized, and a lot of people have been hurt by it. And I think in some ways we've reckoned with it appropriately at certain points, and very clearly not at others, to the detriment of people who were, like you said, doing this labor, or who have been harmed and who are expected to do the labor of kindly coming forward and pleading, with gentleness to their abuser. We can't remove these narratives of abuse within our industry from the work that we're doing. We just can't. If someone's behaving this way in their private life, what are they going to do when they get into a space with someone that's that vulnerable and they're documenting them? So I have huge concerns about that. I don't know if I answered your question. I think there's a long way to go. I think there's a long way to go.
But also when you put mostly men of a certain age, privilege, as role models to emulate, you're not only going to emulate the photograph they take, the equipment they use, you're also going to emulate what you see them perform in closed spaces, even privileged closed spaces. Having said that, I want to go to the other important project that you've been doing, which is documenting the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Again, for our audience, tell us I know this is also a very personal project to you. Tell us about the Mountain Valley Pipeline and why it's important to you, because you're also documenting your home.
Yeah, so I grew up in this region, not exactly where I am now, but close by. And it's a very rural part of Virginia that sits on the edge of the Appalachian region. So this project was announced 6 years ago at this point, I believe, if not a little before that. And it's a fracked gas project. It's a 42-inch natural gas pipeline. So basically, people have been trying, through legal routes, through any possible avenue they can to stop this pipeline for that long. My documentation visually began pretty early on. I did some, photos for people at the very beginning, and then returned to it more seriously and started working on this long-term film back in, I believe it was 2017 at the time, when I really was getting more into it. But basically, it's been a really grassroots campaign of individuals who have, put themselves in front of the project itself, whether through aerial blockades or locking onto equipment, or, different sort of tactics to be visible, protests. It's looked like a lot of different things. And so I saw that, larger coverage wasn't going to be happening. I saw that local coverage was covered in the way of the urgency of the 6 o'clock news or the 12 o'clock news. And it really removes context. And I also know that in this region, the victors tell history like anywhere, right? So it felt and feels important to me that this exists. I kind of call it like an immediate archive, because I know that this footage is going to matter regardless of where it goes, just because it's saying like, this community has been here, and it wasn't just like a here comes the pipeline kind of thing.
Talk to us about, and this is something you do really well in the project, talk to us about the long history of the economic and environmental extraction that happens in these regions, and how the local communities have responded to it.
Yeah, so when you say the word Appalachia, I believe, if you're familiar with it, there's pretty strong stereotypes that exist, and there's been, again, good conversations happening to try to combat this. But the coal industry, coal is king is a phrase that you hear a lot around here. And because of the massive beauty and mineral wealth of this area in the mountains, it's been a long time target of large corporations who saw an opportunity for cheap labor and for massive growth. It meant that they set up coal towns, where people would go in and literally just be paid in basically like what was tantamount to like company money. And so it was only good in the company store and could only be used like in a cyclical way, and they never could climb out of it. Which also mimics things like sharecropping and other oppressive sort of labor tactics that you see elsewhere. But here, that's what it looked like. And it also meant that there was environmental devastation from it. So different forms of coal extraction, mountaintop removal, contaminate water. They make the ecosystem unlivable from sediment runoff, or different components that destabilize what a natural environment would be. with little to no recourse ever, like occasionally there would be a lawsuit if there was cancer somewhere, right? Like people would be able to collectively come together. But so this is the legacy here. And now they're trying to put pipelines through. There were 3 pipeline projects at one point recently trying to be put through this region. And you see that consistently, that because people don't have the wherewithal, to get legal representation, or they don't have the voting power or whatever you want to call it, it's a pattern that continues.
Along with the acts of exploitation, there's also acts of protest. Talk to us about the ways in which these protests have been consistently criminalized. Often there's also a narrative that you never hear from the United States, right? Because the land of the freedom, I mean, it's very interesting because no one calls Chelsea Manning a political prisoner, because political prisoners, oppression, acts of criminalizing dissent are all meant for others. It's not. So I am truly grateful that you continue to do this, but walk us through how these communities have been criminalized.
Well, it's interesting, so many people who became involved with this were like, grandmas and school teachers and, just community members who were losing their farms or their water sources, or, what some would look at and say, that's unexpected. It's part of why it's so important for me to document as well, because we do hear these narratives about like who protests, and it's like, these blue-haired hippie, like there's a lot of like really aggressive stereotypes about what it looks like. That's not what you see here. Like these are people who are literally just fighting for existence here. And I think that it's been remarkable to see the level of violence from the police forces that we've seen. It's remarkable to see the amount that these carceral tactics have been used to deter people. So currently there's 2 individuals that are being held without bond between, their hearing and their trial, which is on a misdemeanor, which is like pretty unprecedented. Normally you wouldn't see that. You've seen really, like I said, really physical violent arrests for people, and just a lot of surveillance. So people have been closely surveilled, and we know that there's programs that are set up, especially around environmental issues, because the money is there, for people to be put onto lists or it's not paranoid to say this, like we know it's happening. So I think it's just, it's really indicative of like a wider sort of growth of this omnipotent sort of hand of being watched and of being controlled. And it takes a really specific sort of moment for people to be able to see themselves as someone that can be present despite knowing all this is going to happen to them. These are people who know this now and who are continuing because they don't really have a choice, right? It's their livelihood, or it's their day-to-day sort of safety.
And you were arrested as well. And I want to discuss this arrest because it's very important, and it's important for us to draw these global parallels, because India, of course, now ranks quite poorly in terms of press freedom. Regularly, our journalists have been picked up, arrested, even for the act of turning up. Talk to us about, again, I know that both of us try not to speak about us in terms of the larger context and not centering us, but I think your arrest is really important. Also, your position, you're still somewhat privileged. You're a white woman so talk to us about your arrest, the consequences that you faced, but also what this means for even the act of documenting these grassroots protests.
My arrest happened in 2018, and I was filming a demonstration in West Virginia at a pipe yard of the company. And there were a number of other media crew present. I should qualify, my charges were ultimately dropped, but I had to get representation from someone who, was well-versed in what they did and was able to talk about press freedom and able to sort of show that like this really would be problematic if it was to go to trial. So I'm hugely privileged in that regard. A lot of people don't have their charges dropped, don't have the connections to be able to be represented in that way. and I even struggled with that, about not going to trial, because I do think there's something to be said for going to trial and being able to prove something and set a precedent. But the cost of that is massive, and people are going through it now after this last summer of protests. And like you said, just the world over, I think when you see this many people in media getting villainized and arrested, it becomes more commonplace. It just becomes like something in the water that people can say, like, oh, we'll deal with it later if we have to. So my arrest, it turned out better, but it definitely changed the way I was working. I believe it also had something to do with that I'm not from West Virginia. So even just over this border of the state, right? I don't have relationships. I don't know how they work. I don't know the edges of how I can operate there. I didn't have any camaraderie with the local news people as I do here at relationships. You're vulnerable as a freelancer, and I know that. I move differently now. I move carefully, and I move, with eyes everywhere. And I think also, it was a bad day. There wasn't any warning, and I got pulled out and cuffed. I've been in a couple other situations where I was worried going in. I've learned to make sure I have legal advice on hand. Some of the press freedom groups do brilliant work and really will be there if you do get arrested. So that's a great thing to know for anyone watching that's concerned. Please use those groups because they're made for it. And also, I think it's not bad to be more aware, but I also think that being strategic and understanding when to push and when to let yourself make more work isn't a bad thing. I don't want people to like run towards the fire every time. I don't think it's necessary.
We are coming closer to the end, and I would like audiences to start putting the questions in. I have one last question for you, and then we will start taking audience questions. America is also going through a very important phase. There's climate change. Of course, there are BLM protests. There is, so much that's happening. What are the ways in which you think through, what are your strategies for documenting the present? I know that your projects are always long term, they're invested in the community, but you're also somebody who's a photojournalist, you are a reporter, you're a writer. How do you think through this moment? Because this is a conversation that I've been having with people about how does one document the empire, especially an empire in decline. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's a really important thing that I try to consider every time I say yes or no to something. It's not at all accidental that I've landed in these realms of where I do work and why I do it and what I focus on. Within my own work, it feels really paramount to me that I'm not repeating the same extractive process that I'm trying to document. So that's like a framework for me. I think with the BLM protests, it was a great time for white folks, particularly, to step back and to support their Black colleagues and their basically whatever ways that we could lift up what work they were doing and the ways that they were imaging this critical moment and these really important things that were happening. That felt for me like the right response at the time. I know other people move differently. There was some blowback on that as well. I think, you can't tell everyone what to do. I don't think a single perspective on anything necessarily, is gonna make the world, like heal the world the way that we talk about photojournalism doing this heavy lifting. I do think it's really appropriate to be able to ask yourself, am I the right person for this? Should I be in this space? Am I compromising the integrity of this moment? Am I making someone feel unsafe in a moment of vulnerability? I wish that question got asked more often, and I wish that people also didn't emphasize like this concept of like you have to be working all the time, you have to have excess money, you have to have all, like this hoarding of jobs and of things. Again, it like repeats these violent things, but more than that, you know, being able to lift people up, to get trust with editors, to have opportunities they wouldn't have, you know, that's important work too, especially if you're framing it and looking at it in this regard, and trying to make an industry that's healthier and not just like, you know, cruising through and like getting clicks and doing the things it's always done.
Suchi, could we open up the thing for questions?
Yes, sure. I mean, we still have a little bit of time in case if you would
Sure.
like to continue for a little bit.
I'm happy to. Laura, are there things that you want to discuss, Laura? I know that I've kind of been bombarding you with questions. Are there things that you want to discuss that we haven't discussed?
Um, I would love to hear, you know, your perspectives on the parallels that you've drawn, from the work that you've seen in the US and the work that you're doing. I think that would be a really rich sort of way to carry on talking if you'd like to share that.
Um, I don't know because I feel like, um, I left home when I was 17. I've been away for more than half my life now. So I'm still trying to really figure out where am I able to tell the story from.
Mhm.
Because in one moment I feel that I'm completely incapable of understanding, the home that I left behind. But also, this country has been my home for the last 10 years. So I'm always in this place where I feel like I do not know enough of those spaces. One of the ways that I've been thinking about, again, which community do I then go and document, right? Do I document the space that I live? Do I document the South Asian communities then? Or do I document? So, in that sense, I am constantly understanding. I do not know what it means to write about America. I really don't know who gets to write about. And recently, I was looking at travel journeys. Like if people traveled and wrote about this country, who are the people who traveled and wrote about? And there's a very specific figure that writes about America, travels in America and writes about America. It's again a white male of a certain age. Of course, notable exceptions could be Lord or James Baldwin, but I wonder what it means to be a brown body and say travel in parts of this country that I have no knowledge about. So I'm constantly in a space where I don't know. I always feel like I'm writing from a place of not knowing, and I'm writing or I'm photographing to learn. So I don't know. I really don't know because um, I remember going through the BLM protests and I didn't want to take any photographs. I didn't want to, I mean, I took photographs as a way to kind of, if I saw a police officer do something for me, then it was documenting a moment of violence, but I was not documenting to tell a story. So I think I should acknowledge the fact that sometimes you don't have to know what it means to tell a story. I think that was very important to me.
I love that.
Yeah. I actually wanted to. I have another question that I wanted to come back to. Um, I also know that in terms of the Mexico Borderlands work, um, are there other works that you like? Because often I feel that we don't ask photographers or writers about other people and their works that they like. Are there other works you think that were done really well that you think are ways that we can think of as um, a visual way to enter into the space to understand the space better? Because I know the bad work that's being done. Do you think that, can you talk to us about, if you, again, you don't have to, but if there's a work that you think that is really good that you feel is a great way to think through this space?
Yeah, I think there's been some really heartfelt work made there. A friend and colleague of mine, Eva Lewis, made a film called Undeterred about the border and about the community that she actually lives in, and the militarization of this community. It's a beautiful film. And it uses techniques like animation and really, really close relationships to sort of unfold this process. Um, I think there's a lot. It's I'm a bit on the spot. Maybe I could compile a list of things a little bit after if people wanted me to share. There's a lot of really wonderful people working and doing, you know, daily photojournalism on the border. In fact, Nick Oza, who's on this call, I think does great work. As well, you know, there's an incredible list of immigration reporters and of people who are really invested in the communities and who are really towing the line and holding people accountable. And I think at its best, you know, this is like ideally the goal of journalism, is to speak truth to power, to make sure that these things aren't able to be misguided and swept under the rug and distorted for consumption or used to propel policies that hurt people forward. Yeah, I would be happy to share. I could like compile a list of people that I love their work. I follow a lot of them too. I'm really grateful to everyone who has dedicated themselves to this. And I also know that a lot of them, like me, have come to this from a place of either personal connection or, you know, living there. I think it's really important that we do have people who are not able to just walk away, and who understand the like daily sort of movement of a place, who understand what it's like to have to drive through a checkpoint every day, or who understand the consequence of these growing policies and what they mean. And yeah. Oh, I think you're muted still.
Sorry, I just said I just got a message from someone. I don't know why they are texting me instead of putting the question in the box. The question is, why was this called? There's a question about how was the title for this conversation picked? Why pick this title? I still don't know why they're texting me, but anyways, it's yeah.
Well, we went through a couple different ones. I think my work is very much about empire, which you picked up on, and I was really glad to name. I think it's important to not mince words for obvious reasons. I also, I said this to you when we were discussing it. I think the act of offering something that's a forward moving motion rather than like a defensive motion feels really important to me. It's a thing that I also keep in mind when I'm working is, a complaint that I have is that news visits a place after the disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And I want joy, and I want camaraderie, and I want love, and I want, solidarity to be things that we're imaging and that we're validating through recording them and through creating these pieces. It's really like the heartbeat of why I do what I do. I'm deeply moved by these moments that, you're literally surrounded by this like massive violent force, and then someone's sharing a meal and laughing and being kind and being generous. To me, like that's the texture of the things that I'm really wanting to talk about, because it also, what it does, I think, is like peel back this definition of violence as only brute force, right? Like violence is insidious, and there's these tiny moments that creep in that aren't called violence but actually are. And so I think it's easier when you're paying attention to the details of that and to the heart of things, that when it's not that, you feel it, and it melts into what you're doing. That's like a long answer to the question about the title, but here we are.
I'll ask one last question before we open up for audience questions. Is a question of documenting white nationalism and police brutality. So I think about almost now 2 years ago, when we did the under photography workshops, one of our students raised a really important point, and she said, and this was discussing Vice magazine, Vice channels documentation of white supremacy soon after, the events that happened. And her critique was, I felt, was very poignant. And she said that, look, you are documenting white nationalism and white supremacy and police brutality as exceptions. You document this one guy who has a bald head, a swastika tattoo on his head, and you document him because then he looks like a caricature. He looks like the exception. He doesn't look like the person on the street. And she also made another point saying that then who then gets to go close enough to this person and then document it? It's again a white person, right? Because then it becomes difficult. Um, since you were talking about, this came up, and I kind of want to put this to you. Yeah, I'll put this to you as a last question, and then we'll open it up. And I'm really curious for you to listen what you think about this.
I was in Charlottesville, actually. I was on assignment. I don't talk about it much.
I didn't know that. Oh wow, okay, I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
I was on assignment, and the reason I agreed to the assignment is because I said I'm going to go there not to document the white nationalists, but to document the community members and how this is impacting them. And it felt really, really important for me as someone with loved ones in that area who's traveled there. You know, my sister went to school there. I have all these personal connections and dear friends there. It felt really important to me that I lift up the voices of the community on that day, because I knew that outlets like Vice were going to go in and do what they did. And are they talented in telling a story quickly and to the point and compellingly? Yes, right? So all the facets of good storytelling are there. What did it change? You know, and to your point, who can be there, right? It was a bunch of dudes geared up, right? Like, I felt really vulnerable in that space. We didn't know how bad it was going to get, but it got really bad. And there were a few other people, you know, women in particular, and we were checking in on each other because it was terrifying. And there were mobs of people looking for fights, and then someone died. So, you know, I've thought a lot about this question of documenting white supremacy in the ways we do. We also see an aesthetic culture of black and white imagery that's garish and of up close. And, you know, you had to go to a cross burning to get that photo, my guy. That's really, I wonder about that. I wonder a lot about that. And I wish that editorially we realize that when we're praising that kind of work, we're still praising being adjacent to white supremacy, quite literally. The closer you can get to the violence, the closer you can get to the thing, we're telling you, you did a good job by doing that. So we're asking people who would be physically put in harm, if not terribly traumatized by this endeavor, to also look at that as the goal. I can't get behind it. I don't see that as like the way forward. And I know that there was like really strong backlash from within Charlottesville, rightfully so, from the community, who felt really mistrustful and who were deeply hurt. As you know, even later there was I don't want to misquote it. There was someone in a movie, it might have been Spike Jonze, who used footage of Heather Hyder's death against the wishes of people in Charlottesville. So again, it's like, you know, I've been talking about this with the really gross publishing of the Khmer Rouge victims that happened recently. I don't know if people on this call heard about this, but please look it up. Vice published a project by an Irish photographer who retouched photos of victims who had been killed by Khmer Rouge. It speaks to this thing of like, archives are not ours to own. And if we're going to enter into a space of using other people's stories and images, we need to be really careful with what we're doing and understand that like, it's not the past doesn't stay in the past. Like, here we are, and it's like constantly mixing around us.
No, but it really goes to the heart of the question, right? Who gets to take away a certain piece of history or just a certain piece of a present and then circulate it and recirculate it, and for what purpose? The Khmer Rouge archive thing, you know, I know it had a lot of backlash, but what is interesting is that the Magnum archive that now houses entire bodies of work that are just works of kids being raped, or kids or women or underage kids in, you know, in these really awkward, weird, sexualized positions, continue to exist. Nobody's talking about that archive, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk. I mean, why should have never published that retouched work? And there's so much that's problematic. But even within the conversation about archive, what archive are we talking about? right? And then somebody said, "Oh, no, 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 I think it's time for Magnum to have a conversation." I said, it's not about conversation anymore. That archive shouldn't exist. What is a function of an archive? And this is a question, that's there, right? So what is the function of an archive? That is simply an archive that documents the suffering of Black and brown bodies. Should that
And
archive
that's
exist?
owned
Yeah,
by predominantly white corporations, right? So it's
yeah,
not
the
just
corporation.
white ownership, it's white profitable ownership,
Yeah,
which again repeats all of these things that we've been talking about. Like I think that's the thing I wish people just made more connection of. Like none of this is abstract. Like these are patterns, and if you look for them, you will see. Like you can't unsee it once the veil comes off. It's like you see it over and over again in like microcosms and in the bigger picture. There's also the important thing, the ruling about the Harvard
hmm,
uh, archives of enslaved folks, and the families of these enslaved individuals were denied rights, ownership of these photos. And a lot of people were saying that it's a copyright issue, and it becomes this thing of letting people make a living off of being a photographer. It like somehow degrades the integrity of copyright law. um, I don't know. I wonder about the integrity of copyright law. I don't. It's not. Yeah, they're none of them can be disconnected from one another. And you make a great point. I think there are smaller conversations online happening about Magnum in a specific sort of context. But no, people, um, they've been pretty opaque in their response, even to really direct questions about what their archives are doing and how they're labeled and where they're able to be sold and for who and for what. Um, yeah, it's important. It's important stuff.
I promise this is my last follow-up question, and then I also feel like we haven't like caught up for so long that I'm just like
I
chatting with
know I could do this for a while. We'll do it later.
Don't hesitate, Suchitra. I think people are enjoying this conversation. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box, so go on
Okay.
with your questions.
Um,
Yeah.
okay. So what I'll do is, I know it's an hour's mark, and I also don't want to like infringe on Laura's time. So I'll ask this last question, and then if you don't have any questions, Suchi, if you want to come in, that would be great. Anyways, the question is, why do you think that we're not having conversations about it? Why is it easier for us to challenge, say, an individual? It was, I mean, at least we challenged him and it was taken out. But why is Magnum still an holy grail? Like there are still people who want to, like, even the very folks who are critical of Magnum. I know it's not profitable anymore to be I mean, it's not. I don't think anyone makes money being a Magnum photographer anymore. But why is Magnum still the holy grail? Why aren't we're still having conversations about, oh, let's have a conversation? Why aren't we having conversations about this archive should not exist? Burn this down. I mean, not burn it down in the literal sense, that this archive should not exist. Nobody should have access to images of exploitation. Why do you think that is?
um, I think we're looking at the processes of like decolonizing museums and how museums are actually sites of great theft and violence, of owning histories and of sacred objects. And it's another similar thing to that. Um, Going after an individual is easier. Like this week, we got a conviction and people are like, oh, justice. But then a little girl, a little 15-year-old girl is killed moments later. That's not justice. We're not living in a system of justice if that's possible. It very quickly, it went from like, maybe relief to immediately like, oh, here's a reminder of where you are. You know, you don't actually get to feel that safety. Like done. Um, I I don't quite understand the appeal. I think power is like a very it's like the way the industry functions. And people, I know that I've felt fear in speaking out at certain times, because you do feel consequences, and people do say, oh, you can't possibly be objective enough, you can't possibly mean what you're saying, you're a Looney Tune, like all these things to discredit you, to make you seem irrational, emotional, right? Like common tactics.
Livelihood, right? I know cases in which people have been vindictive, where projects, jobs, fellowships are being taken away from people for simply speaking. So this is
Yeah,
not. Um,
yeah.
so power
I
also has a very direct relationship to livelihood, because not
mhm.
everybody has a trust fund.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the threats, they're not mild. I think that every now and then someone will get sacrificed if they've done something egregious enough, often enough, publicly enough. But that takes a lot of repetition, a lot of people keeping receipts, a lot of people returning to it, again, labor, as you mentioned. And so the burden constantly falls on the individual who is going to be harmed by it. The thing about archives is like, unless there's a living relative or unless there's someone that can speak to it directly. And even then, again, it becomes like, well, you're biased. You would feel this way. You don't understand the value of we're like we're erasing history by not having a monument to the Confederacy. It's like, how dissimilar is it when we say, take away an archive of just straight up suffering or put it in the hands of someone who's going to respect it. Mm-hmm. I feel like every week there's a new thing about an archive that's just been like brutally mishandled at the expense of the souls that we're dealing with. Like this, the haunting of these things. I don't think it could be understated, and whether or not you believe that, if that's a part of your, experience, there's consequences, there just are. And yeah, it just keeps going.
It does keep going. Suchi, we are a little past the 1 hour mark.
Just about. So
Just about.
how do you both feel? Are you keen on maybe any last points that you would like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I'll let Laura too. One thing I really the reason I wanted so badly to have this conversation with Laura is, it's hard to do one great body of work and do it so well. And in her case, she's done not one, but many bodies of work that's just incredibly brilliant. And I've always gone back to learn from them. So I'm so glad that I got to have this conversation. And I also just hope that all of you here actually go back and look at both of these works. So yeah, I'll let Laura make the I would love Laura to make the final concluding marks, and then we can close up. And then Suchi, if you want to make a concluding mark, that would be great as well.
Gosh, thank you so much. I'm like very moved by that. That's a very high compliment. And I regard you so highly. That really means so much to me. Thank you again for having me here. I think if anything, I want to be transparent. It feels important to be transparent that, I've always said to myself that I will stop doing the work when it stops being fulfilling, or when I stop being sure about what I'm doing, when there's not that like ping of sort of yes in me. And there's been moments when it's come and gone. And I think I would just like to say that it's not a failure to change directions as you're working. It's not a failure to reroute the ways that you're working or the things that you're considering. It's not a failure to be doing other things that support your work on the side, to let you do the kind of work you want. Those are all things that's taken me a long time to get comfortable with. And those are also things that you don't hear a lot, in wider spaces. And so I just want to affirm people that, on things that you don't see around you doesn't mean you're doing them wrong. If you're trusting yourself and if you're building relationships that are meaningful, like for me, that's been the thing that sustained me, and that is that's let me feel like I'm not totally blowing in the wind or running amok, But yeah, if anyone wants to connect, I'd love to connect with anyone who's taken the time. And again, thank you all for being on this call at this time. I'm wishing you all good health, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me. I'm really, really glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Laura and Suchitra, for this conversation today. I hope that there are structures and systems of care for our journalists who are really, out there, because I think that's where sometimes they end up changing course because of the unpredictability of having to do the meaningful work and not being able to see some kind of results, and thank you for doing all the good work that both of you have been doing. I think it's very inspiring for everybody who's attended today. And I know there are many, many people who probably haven't been able to join today, and they've been asking me for, the recorded links, which we will be sharing towards the end of the month. So thanks once again. Thank you everyone for joining in, and please stay safe. Look forward to maybe collaborating with you sometime soon later. Thank you.
Thank you.